Imagine you are a Japanese kamikaze pilot in 1945. The war is lost, but your resolve is iron. You are diving your Zero fighter at 400 miles per hour, screaming down from the clouds toward the Allied fleet below. Your target is a massive aircraft carrier, the ultimate prize. You've been trained to aim for the flight deck, the ship's most vulnerable point. If you hit an American carrier, your plane will punch through the wooden deck, exploding deep inside the hangar, igniting fuel lines and munitions, likely crippling the ship for months. But today, you aren't diving on an American ship. You are diving on a ship flying the Royal Navy ensign. You line up your sights, brace for the end, and crash directly onto the flight deck. But instead of a catastrophic inferno that guts the ship, there is just a loud clang. Your plane disintegrates on the surface, sliding off the side into the sea like a discarded toy. Inside the ship, the crew barely spills their tea. On the loudspeakers, a calm British voice commands, "Sweepers, man your brooms." This wasn't a miracle. It was engineering. For years, the Japanese Imperial Navy believed that striking an aircraft carrier meant striking a floating tinderbox. Against the Americans, they were often right. But when the British Pacific Fleet arrived in 1945, Japanese pilots faced a terrifying realization. Their enemy was flying off of floating steel fortresses that simply refused to burn. To understand why Japanese pilots feared the British ships, we first have to look at their primary opponent, the United States Navy. The Americans built their carriers, particularly the legendary Essex class, with a very specific, aggressive philosophy. Offense is the best defense. The American naval strategists believed in the Sunday punch. Their doctrine was built on the idea that the best way to protect a carrier wasn't to cover it in armor, but to ensure that no enemy plane ever got close enough to drop a bomb in the first place. To achieve this, you needed planes, hundreds of them. The floating airfields American carriers were essentially massive floating parking lots. They were designed to carry the largest air wings possible, often housing over 90 to 100 aircraft per ship. This was nearly double the capacity of their British counterparts. The logic was cold but sound. If you have 90 planes and the enemy has 50, you can launch a combat air patrol so dense that it forms an impenetrable wall in the sky. You can find the enemy fleet first, strike them harder, and sink them before they even know where you are. But to carry that many planes, you needed a massive hangar and a huge flight deck. And this created a physics problem: top heaviness. The problem of gravity. If you put 3 inches of solid steel armor on the flight deck of a massive carrier, you are adding thousands of tons of weight to the very top of the ship. In the rough waters of the Pacific, this makes the ship unstable. It would roll violently in storms, making it impossible to land planes, or worse, it could capsize if it took a torpedo hit. To keep these ships stable, fast, and capable of carrying a massive payload of bombs and fuel, U.S. naval architects made a controversial decision. They built the flight decks out of teak wood. Yes, the most powerful warships in human history were topped with planks of wood. The teak deck vulnerability, to be fair, this wasn't backyard lumber. It was high-grade teak, laid over thin steel plating. It was durable, rot-resistant, and offered excellent grip for tires. But against a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb or a diving Kamikaze Zero, teak would offer about as much protection as a sheet of paper. This design choice meant that the flight deck offered zero structural resistance to an impact. When a Japanese dive bomber released its payload, the bomb wouldn't explode on contact with the deck. Instead, its delayed fuse allowed it to smash effortlessly through the wood, plunging deep into the bowels of the ship before detonating. This was the nightmare scenario. The bomb wouldn't blow up in the open air. It would explode inside the hangar deck. The inferno below the hangar deck of a U.S. carrier was the most dangerous place on Earth during battle. It was crowded with fully fueled planes, racks of high-explosive bombs, and miles of hoses pumping highly flammable aviation gasoline, AV gas. Because U.S. carriers were designed for warm Pacific weather, they had open hangars. The sides of the ship could be rolled up like garage doors to allow ventilation. While this was great for crew comfort, in a fire it was fatal. These open sides created a cross-draft, feeding oxygen to any fire and turning the hangar into a blast furnace. The tragedy of the USS Franklin, the cost of this design, was paid in blood on March 19, 1945, aboard the USS Franklin. A single Japanese bomber dropped 2 semi-armor piercing bombs. They didn't scratch the paint on the flight deck. They smashed right through the wood and detonated among armed and fuel planes on the hangar deck. The result wasn't just a fire, it was a chain reaction. The initial blast ignited the gas tanks of the parked planes. Then, the heat cooked off the bombs and rockets strapped to those planes. The Franklin was consumed by a series of explosions so violent that pilots in the air miles away reported seeing the 27,000-ton ship literally bounce in the water. Over 800 American sailors died, many of them incinerated instantly, because the wooden deck offered no lid to contain the blast or protect the vitals of the ship. The horror of the USS Bunker Hill weeks later. The USS Bunker Hill suffered a similar fate. 2 kamikazes smashed through the wooden deck within 30 seconds of each other. The wooden planks splintered, pouring burning gasoline down into the lower decks and ventilation shafts. The ship didn't sink, thanks to the heroic damage control teams who were undeniably the best in the world. But the vessel was gutted. It was a floating wreck of twisted metal and ash, knocked out of the war completely. The Americans accepted this risk. They viewed carriers as expendable assets in a war of attrition. They believed that having 100 planes in the air was worth the risk of a wooden deck. But across the Atlantic, the British Royal Navy had looked at this problem and come to a very different, steel-hardened conclusion. While the Americans were building floating airfields designed to punch hard, the Royal Navy was building floating bunkers designed to take a beating. To understand why, you have to look at the map. The U.S. Navy was preparing to fight in the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where enemies were thousands of miles apart. The British, however, were fighting in the bathtub of the Mediterranean and the cold, gray waters of the North Sea. The geography of fear in the Mediterranean, there's nowhere to hide. A British ship was almost always within range of land-based German Stuka bombers and Italian torpedo planes. The Royal Navy didn't have the luxury of spotting the enemy from 200 miles away. In the narrow seas of Europe, attacks came fast, with little warning, and often in overwhelming numbers. The British Admiralty looked at this tactical nightmare and realized a terrifying truth. We cannot stop every bomber. The ship is going to get hit. So, they threw out the conventional rulebook and built the illustrious class carriers. The steel box concept that the American carrier was a sword, the British carrier was a shield. The design philosophy was radically different. Instead of a wooden deck on top of a lightweight hull, the British treated the hangar deck like a bank vault. They built what they called an armored citadel. The hangar, the large room where the planes are stored, was essentially a steel box located deep inside the ship. The floor was armored, the walls were armored, and most importantly, the roof, which served as a flight deck, was plated with 3 to 4 inches of solid, high-tensile steel. This wasn't just metal plating. This was armor thick enough to stop a 1,000-pound bomb. The closed hangar difference, but the armor was only half the story. The British also designed their hangars to be completely enclosed. Remember the American ships with their garage door sides that let in air? The British sealed their hangars tight. This created a dark, somewhat claustrophobic workspace for mechanics, but had a genius safety benefit. If a fire started inside a British hangar, there was no cross-draft to feed it oxygen. The crew could seal the compartment, turn on the fire suppression sprinklers, and suffocate the fire in minutes. On an American ship, the wind would whip the flames into an inferno. On a British ship, the fire would simply run out of air. The heavy price of armor this protection, however, came at a steep price. Armor is heavy. Putting thousands of tons of steel on the top of a ship raises its center of gravity. To keep the illustrious class ships from capsizing, the British had to make the hangars smaller and store fewer planes. While an American Essex-class carrier could boast an air wing of 90 to 100 aircraft, a British illustrious class carrier struggled to carry 36 to 50. The American mockery when the British Pacific Fleet finally arrived to help the Americans fight Japan in 1945, the U.S. Navy liaison officers were initially unimpressed. They looked at these British ships and saw a wasted potential. They joked that the British carriers were pretty but toothless. The Americans argued that the best defense was a strong offense. Why worry about getting hit? They asked, if you can launch 100 planes and destroy the enemy before they even take off. They called the British designs overcautious and criticized them for lacking the offensive punch needed to win the war. To the Americans, the British ships looked like relics of defensive mindset that had no place in the fast-paced Pacific War. The table turns, but war has a way of humbling the arrogant. As 1945 progressed, the Japanese military realized they could no longer match the U.S. Navy in a fair fight. They switched tactics to the divine wind, the kamikaze. Suddenly, the offense is the best defense strategy fell apart. You couldn't stop every kamikaze. It didn't matter if you had 100 fighters in the air. If just one fanatic pilot slipped through the net, he became a guided missile. When the kamikaze started diving, the American wooden decks turned into splintered death traps. But when those same suicide planes dove at the British fleet, the toothless British carriers revealed their true nature. They weren't toothless. They were indestructible. The American laughter stopped abruptly when they realized that the armored box was a design flaw. It was the only thing standing between the ship and the bottom of the ocean. The theoretical debates between American and British architects ended abruptly on April 1st, 1945. It was Easter Sunday, and it was the first day of the invasion of Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. The British Pacific Fleet, known as Task Force 57, was tasked with suppressing Japanese airfields on the Sakishima Islands to stop reinforcements from reaching Okinawa. The Japanese response was immediate and ferocious. They unleashed the Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, attacks, mass waves of suicide planes committed to death. The moment of impact high above the fleet, a lone Japanese Zero fighter pilot spotted the flat, gray silhouette of the British carrier HMS Indefatigable. He didn't hesitate. He tipped his wing and began a terminal dive. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a human guidance system for a 550-pound armor-piercing bomb strapped to his belly. On the bridge of the Indefatigable, the alarm klaxon screamed. Anti-aircraft gunners poured a stream of tracer fire into the sky, filling the air with black puffs of flak. But the Zero was moving too fast. It cut through the defensive fire, screaming down at 350 miles per hour. Standing on the bridge was a U.S. Navy liaison officer, assigned to coordinate between the British and American fleets. He had seen what happened when a kamikaze hit a carrier before. He knew the drill. He instinctively braced himself for the ship to shudder violently, for the deck to buckle, and for a fireball to erupt from the hangar lift, incinerating everyone in its path. He expected the ship to be out of the war for 6 months, limping back to Pearl Harbor with hundreds of dead sailors. The collision of Zero smashed directly into the flight deck, right near the island superstructure. The impact was sickeningly loud. The plane disintegrated instantly. The 550-pound bomb, it was carrying detonated simultaneously. But then, something strange happened. Or rather, something didn't happen. There was no secondary explosion. There was no fireball erupting from the bowels of the ship. The ship didn't list. Because of the 3-inch armored steel deck, the Japanese plane didn't penetrate the ship. It crumpled on the surface like a soda can thrown against a brick wall. The bomb, designed to explode deep inside the ship, went off on top of the armor. The blast wave went up and out, not down. Make it so, inside the hangar deck, directly beneath the explosion, the mechanics and pilots looked up. They heard a massive clang, like a giant sledgehammer hitting the roof. Dust fell from the overhead pipes. A few light bulbs shattered. They looked at each other, checked for leaks, realized the roof was holding, and went back to work. Up on the flight deck, the scene was chaotic but manageable. There was a fire, fueled by the burning gasoline of the suicide plane. There was twisted metal everywhere, but the ship itself was intact. The damage control officer looked at the smoldering wreckage and the dent in the steel plates, a depression about 3 inches deep. He didn't call for an evacuation. He didn't signal that the ship was sinking. He turned to the deck crew and issued an order that has become legendary in naval history. Sweepers, man your brooms. The 40-minute miracle, it wasn't a metaphor. The crew literally grabbed push brooms and fire hoses. They sprayed the burning wreckage off the side of the ship. They pushed the twisted metal of the Zero into the ocean. Then, in a stroke of improvisation that defines a British stiff upper lip, they mix a batch of quick-drying cement and filled in the dent in the steel deck, smoothing it out so plane wheels wouldn't get stuck. 37 minutes later, the Indefatigable signaled the flagship, ready to operate aircraft. 40 minutes after being hit by a suicide weapon designed to sink capital ships, HMS Indefatigable launched a supermarine seafire to rejoin the fight. The psychological victory, the U.S. liaison officer was stunned. He had never seen anything like it. This event gave birth to the famous naval witticism that summarized the difference between the two navies. When a kamikaze hits a U.S. carrier, it is damage control, all hands at battle stations, and 6 months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a British carrier, it is sweepers, man your brooms, and tea is served at 4. But for the Japanese, this was a psychological catastrophe. Imagine the mindset of the kamikaze pilots, waiting in reserve. You have been told that your sacrifice will destroy the enemy. You watch your comrade dive into a British ship. You see the explosion. You cheer for his glorious death. And then, before the smoke is even cleared, you see the same ship turning into the wind and launching planes to kill you. It made the British carriers appear not just powerful, but supernatural. They were steel beasts that simply refused to die, turning the Japanese strategy of self-sacrifice into a futile waste of life. By the time the smoke cleared over Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the debate between the American and British naval architects was settled not by arguments in a boardroom, but by the undeniable data of war. The cost of victory, it is important to acknowledge that the American strategy worked. The wooden deck philosophy allowed the U.S. Navy to flood the Pacific with thousands of aircraft. This overwhelming offensive power, the Sunday Punch, is what ultimately broke the back of the Japanese Imperial Navy. The Essex-class carriers were the sledgehammers that won the war. But that victory came with a butcher's bill attached. The cost of prioritizing speed and capacity over protection was paid in human lives. When American carriers like the USS Franklin, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Intrepid were hit, they didn't just suffer damage, they suffered catastrophes. Hundreds of sailors died in infernos that melted steel and vaporized aircraft. The wooden decks allowed the enemy to strike at the heart of the ship, turning the vessel's own fuel and munitions against it. In contrast, the British Pacific Fleet took hit after hit, sometimes from multiple kamikazes in a single day, and yet not a single British armored carrier was sunk or permanently put out of action by a suicide plane. The HMS Formidable was hit twice in 4 days. In an American ship, this would have likely been fatal. In the British ship, the armored deck contained the blast, and the ship continued to fight. The psychology of futility, this physical resilience, created a psychological weapon that was perhaps even more powerful than the armor itself. We must look at this through the eyes of the Japanese pilots. The kamikaze tactic was born of desperation, but it was sustained by a spiritual belief in the nobility of sacrifice. A pilot could accept his own death if he knew it would strike a blow for the emperor. He needed to believe that his death mattered. When a Japanese pilot dove into an American carrier and saw a massive pillar of fire rise into the sky, he died believing he had succeeded. He had traded his life for a capital ship. There was glory in that. But the British carriers represented futility. Imagine the morale-crushing reality of the pilot who followed the first attacker. He watches his wingman dive into HMS Victorious or HMS Indefatigable. He sees the explosion. He prepares to follow up on the attack. But as he rolls in for his run, he sees the British crew calmly sweeping the debris of his friend off the deck. He sees the ship turning, unharmed. He sees new Spitfires and Corsairs launching from the very spot where his friend just died. To the Japanese, the British ships felt like throwing an egg at a tank. It robbed the kamikaze pilots of their glory. It turned their divine wind into a meaningless breeze against a steel mountain. There is no greater fear in war than the fear that your sacrifice is useless. The quiet admission after the war ended, the United States Navy conducted a massive strategic review. They analyzed every hit, every fire, and every casualty, while they publicly celebrated their victory. Privately, the naval architects admitted the British were right. The age of the propeller was ending. The jet age was beginning. Jet aircraft were significantly heavier than the Zeros and Wildcats of World War II. They landed faster and hit the deck harder. A wooden deck simply couldn't handle the punishment of a 20-ton jet slamming onto it at 150 miles per hour. Furthermore, the missiles and bombs of the Cold War were far more deadly than the unguided gravity bombs of 1945. The U.S. Navy realized that survivability could no longer be sacrificed for capacity. They needed ships that could take a hit and keep fighting. The modern legacy of the result was the Midway-class carriers, commissioned just days after the war ended, which featured heavily armored decks. This evolution continued into the supercarriers we see today. If you look at a modern Nimitz-class or the new Gerald R. Ford-class carrier, you are looking at the ultimate hybrid of the two World War II philosophies. They have the massive size and air wing capacity of the American Essex class, combined with the armored citadel protection of the British Illustrious class. Today, every major warship in the world follows a lesson taught by the Royal Navy in 1945. The legacy of those British crews, standing amidst the smoke, manning their brooms, and pouring tea while under attack, lives on in the steel DNA of the modern U.S. Navy. They proved a timeless military truth. Firepower wins battles, but armor saves lives. And in the long run, the ship that can take a punch is just as dangerous as the ship that can throw one. So, if you were a sailor in 1945, which deck would you rather stand on? The offensive powerhouse of the Americans or the floating fortress of the British? Let me know your choice in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button. It helps us get these stories out to more people. And for more history from the front lines, make sure to subscribe to The Last Offensive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.